Welcome back and happy Valentine's Day. I hope everybody's having a very romantic day. Maybe you sent flowers, maybe you got flowers. From me, you're not going to get any flowers, but you are going to get some good recommendations on my favorite books about love and romance, and some books that are not necessarily your classic Jane Austen or Wuthering Heights kind of books, but things that are maybe a little bit further away from the usual beaten track. Let's start with the most obvious, most contemporary maybe, and we'll work our way through that. I think one of my favorite love stories in the last few years was the novel Normal People by Sally Rooney. This is an easy go-to recommendation, even for anyone not just looking for love books, but also for any book to read and to get back into the habit of reading. Her style is super simple to read, but the characters are super well developed. In this particular book, she talks about a love story that has to cut across a very obvious and at times painful class divide between a girl from a wealthy background and a boy from more modest means, and they know each other from high school, and their story goes through different periods in their lives. And I'm not going to give any spoilers. Is it a happy love story or a more tragic love story? That's for you to find out. But I'm sure that if you read this, you'll really enjoy it, and it allows you to dive into Sally Rooney's bibliography, which includes other wonderful books like Conversations with Friends, which also has an element of love to it, more connected to friendship or different types of relationships, and her more recent book, Beautiful World, Where Are You?, which I really enjoyed. So Sally Rooney, I'm a big fan. Again, it's easy to read. The style's very fluid. It's easy to dive into, but it's not superficial, and you can dive into the characters and their emotions with a lot of ease. The next book I'd mention, which is a classic from the 60s, one of my favorite books of all time, by one of my favorite authors of all time, is The French Lieutenant's Woman, or French Lieutenant's Woman, if you're American, by the British author John Fowles. He's one of my favorite authors because he was such an innovator and pioneer in toying with the form and structure of novels. And this is him doing this at his best. It's called metafiction. It's when the author plays with the form and structure of the book, but also, for example, inserts himself into the storytelling. So at one point in the book, John Fowles appears in a train carriage with the protagonist, and so that's kind of playful and interesting, and he toys with the influence of historical events in this pivotal era, which is the Victorian era. So no prizes for guessing that this is a book about a form of forbidden love in the Victorian era between a gentleman and a woman of lowly virtue, the titular French lieutenant's woman, and this is an impossible love, which of course makes it all the more ardent and powerful and passionate. And I really like the way that the author portrayed this forbidden love, but also toyed with the codes of the era's romantic literature, and also of the impending explosions of change that were coming. Namely, for example, mentioning upcoming writers like Darwin and Marx, who were on the verge of revolutionizing science and social sciences. So it's super well done, and a very romantic, powerful story, which is also very innovative in the way it deals with that genre of the love story. So I really recommend this. If you've never read John Fowles, this is a great way to go about it, great way to dive into that author, and then there's a vast bibliography of his that you can explore further. In a more modern bibliography about love, one book that really struck me when I read it about 6 or 7 years ago is a collection of short stories by the Dominican-American author, Junot Diaz. And this collection of short stories is called This Is How You Lose Her. Now, these are all short stories connected to a central character in the bibliography of Junot Diaz, who also features in his other book, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, which is a phenomenal book in and of itself, but not so centrally connected to love as this collection of short stories is. The central character of these short stories, Junior, is an alter ego, a literary alter ego for Junot Diaz. He's a character that upon whom Junot Diaz has built a lot of his inspiration and storytelling. And so through these short stories, we're going to see the emotional, romantic development of this character, how he cheats on his girlfriend, how he loves his girlfriends, how he develops his relationships, and so on. I can't go into much further detail. I just remember how powerful it was, and again, how easy it was to read. The author, Junot Diaz, has developed a really interesting language, syntax, vernacular around this character that's sort of part Dominican homie, part American lover boy. And it's a really interesting form. It's a really interesting way for a character who's on the surface very macho to show his emotions and true feelings to the women he loves. And I really, really like this book. Now let's rewind again back to more classical literature and one of my favorite books of the last few years, which was The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. And I know what you're thinking. God, this sounds so boring. And it's exactly what I thought when I picked up this book. I was like, I've never read Edith Wharton. It's going to be boring, but I'm going to plow through it. And at least now I can claim to have read Edith Wharton. And oh my God, was I mistaken. This is anything but boring. It's super fun. It's super readable. It's tragic, not going to lie. There's no spoiler alert here. But this is the most important thing you should remember, is that it is very readable and very well put together, and a great examination of society of New York, I think in the 1870s. And, you know, today we think of New York as a very permissive place where everything's sort of allowed and is super fun. But in those days, in that era, in the 1870s, it was a very stratified, rigid society with very strong rules. So it does have that sort of Victorian vibe to it, but in New York, it seemed to be even more traditional. And again, it's a tale of forbidden love between a gentleman of New York and a woman who's too scandalous to love because of her past affairs and so on and so forth. And it is super well plotted. There's a lot of twists and turns in the tale, and you keep thinking, is he going to get her? Is he not going to get her? Can he resist this stratification of society and these codes and these rules, or is he going to bend? Again, I'm not going to spoil, except to say that the ending of the last page is probably one of the most powerful, love-intensive endings that I've read in a really long time. I mean, such an emotional punch. Again, a happy punch or a negative punch, not going to say. But The Age of Innocence, what a lovely tale of love, of passion, of devotion. I never saw the movie, directed by Martin Scorsese, so I can't comment on that. But the main character was played by Daniel Day-Lewis, who was falling in love with Michelle Pfeiffer, so one might assume it was a pretty good movie. And then the final book that I'm going to talk about is actually a French book, which I know is a little bit of a difficult sell sometimes, because it depends on if you can read French or if the book's been translated. This is one of my favorite love stories of all time. It's a classic French book from the 50s. It has been translated into English, and the original title of the book in French is L'écume des jours, which stands for the froth of the days. In English, the most recent translation is froth on the daydream, but it's also been translated as mood indigo, I think. So there's different translations. The author is called Boris Vian, and he was a really interesting poet in Paris in the 50s. In the jazz age of Paris, he was a jazz lover who used to go to these jazz nightclubs. He was a poet. He wrote this very modern contemporary poetry in the 50s. And he wrote this amazing love story. It's a jazzy love story, slightly surreal. It kind of anticipated the French New Wave of movies like Breathless, all the movies of Godard that were, really swinging and cool. This is a predecessor of that. It's a love story between a young man and a young woman in a slightly surreal Paris. They're surrounded by these weird inventions. Like the guy has a piano that if you play a certain jazz tune, it'll make a certain cocktail for you depending on the tune you play. It's an alternative universe where these French intellectuals like Jean-Paul Sartre are present, but in a slightly satirical way. And it starts off in a really fun way, and then it veers into something a little more tragic, but no spoilers. Does it swing back into something happier or not? That's for you to find out. I really love this book. It's a really powerful love story. I think one of the greatest love stories ever told. The setting of Paris in a jazzy sci-fi age is really enchanting. It's very innocent and very powerful. And if you can find it, either in French, that would be amazing, or in English, I might recommend maybe an older translation, a more classic edition. In any case, those are my favorites in terms of some great love stories that I've read in the past. But I'd love to hear from any of you if you've got any to suggest. It'd be great to find out from you all what books have inspired you in terms of love and romance. I'm sure I'm forgetting quite a few, but those were some that popped into my mind on this Valentine's Day. I hope everybody's having an amazing time today. And in the meantime, keep reading. Thanks a lot. Bye.